Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-henry, as always. And today on the podcast, we have a returning guest, a longtime friend of the podcast. And this is David Tizzard. David Tizzard, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me back. A pleasure as always, Jed.
Always a pleasure. And, as soon as today's topic came out, which is Squid Game, or as I tend to slip up and say Squid Games, I think I'm stealing from the Hunger Games there. Right. You're the first person that came to mind, and you know a lot more about certain aspects of this than I could possibly get to. So let's save some of the interesting things for a little bit later, and let's jump in to an early place and somewhere which I read your weekly article, and I see you make a lot of comment on what is Korean drama, what is Korean music, what is this Korean wave. So first question, how much of this is a Korean drama? How much of it is it? Because I imagine some part of it had its path paved for it by, Parasite and shows like that, but it is quite different as well. So let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. It's definitely a Korean drama, but it's like the third wave, fourth wave, however you want to call these developments, because early Korean dramas were characterized by their Cinderella love stories and the way they develop very middle class themes, very easy watching, something you could watch with your parents. It's not going to shock you too much. And that was what Korean dramas were. Not the movies, actually, but the dramas were always like that from Winter Sonata onwards. And they were incredibly popular, particularly in Asia. People loved those dramas. But what we've seen recently in the last, let's say, 5 years or so, perhaps a little bit longer, the dramas have started taking their content specifically from webtoons. And this might be Sweet Home was one example. Itaewon Class was another one. And these webtoons, these comics, that we shouldn't understand them as comics in the Western sense, because I grew up reading things like The Beano or The Dandy, and it was, Dennis the Menace, these kind of kids stories. But webtoons and comics in Northeast Asia, in South Korea, they have very adult themes, and they're a way of dealing with these issues. And so dramas recently have started taking the content from these webtoons, using them as a source of inspiration. It's interesting to see that perhaps that's what's happening in Hollywood as well, where every movie now is the 10th reboot of Batman or another Avengers spin-off or a DC universe and what's going on. But where we've seen all of those Hollywood ones before, and we're getting rehashes, by dipping into this Korean content, these webtoons, we're getting these new ideas that, are a little bit more novel. They're a little bit more interesting. They're a new take on things, particularly in the Korean drama. So it's definitely a Korean drama. It's a new version of a Korean drama, and it has that critical realism. It will deal with problems in society. It doesn't showcase, just the best of what South Korea is, but and in that sense, it's going the way that the movies always have. Because if you go back to Old Boy, to Memories of Murder, things like this, they've always had that critical view of Korean society for the last 20, 30 years. Now the dramas are doing that. And what's interesting is they're doing it and being successful. I guess the last point I'd probably make about Korean dramas is that what makes them Korean first and foremost is that they have Korean people in them. So it could be a period drama about Korean history. It could be a modern rom-com. It could be a zombie thing, but they all get classified as Korean dramas, right? Despite huge disparities in their themes and everything, but they're Korean dramas because they have Korean people in them. It's that ethnicity that matters. It's that production that matters. That aside, for me, what I notice when I watch Korean dramas, and I watch a lot of them to stay up to date with what's going on. But what I found with Korean dramas is that they will show you a person's face for about 10 seconds, sometimes longer, with no dialogue. And that's a long time. And it helps that these people are, incredibly attractive and beautiful. But a lot of the communication happens in Korean dramas through non-verbal communication. So you'll see something play out, and then you'll see the people's faces for a long time, and you're meant to infer, you're meant to intuit what's going on. And this is something that I've like once I started noticing that, I couldn't help but seeing it. I was just seeing it everywhere in the dramas. It was confirmation bias. But for me, that's what a current Korean drama is, and that's what they do.
So I imagine watching this TV series, so Squid Game, of course, you're captivated by the North Korean lady. Then I was. I thought it's apparently it's her first role, but she doesn't say very much. But just the facial expression is full of this gripping kind of emotion. It's hard to break yourself away from. And it was when she. By the way, before I say this is going to have a bucket load of spoilers in this podcast. So if you don't want to go any further, stop right now. But when she dies, or when you realize she has to live at certain moments in the game, it is absolutely groundbreakingly emotional, and she doesn't say very much.
And that's key. Like Korean dramas, whether they're this sort of critical real or the romantic, they are emotional. They really tug at you. And I think that's something that they do so well that, you know, sometimes we get scared of emotional. We don't want that, but these really do it well. And you're completely correct about the Saebyok, the North Korean Dalbukja defector character. She's charismatic, she's captivating, and you're drawn in to what's going to happen to her. But it's not always based on dialogue. Of course, the dialogue's there, but it's just about being pulled into these people and with all those shots of the faces. That's what does it for me. Maybe I watch dramas differently from other people. You know, you might engage with them differently, but for me, it's those big, long shots of people's faces and very little dialogue being said at those points that moves it for me.
So there's a North Korean lady, as we just mentioned here. We'll come back to her because I think there's a lot of interesting moral questions about Korean society there. Yeah. But one of the things I'm sure you noticed when this kicks off is that they've done a huge amount of effort to show that this is a complete spectrum of Korean society stuck inside this room. Of course, there's the North Korean defector, there's a gangster, an old man, there's a foreigner, educated people, uneducated people, a complete range of stuff. And I believe you said it just before. I imagine this has something to do with that inequality and that analogy that I'm assuming the director is trying to run here and say, what is happening here is a microcosm for the horrors and the suffering that is happening outside in Korea.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. I have spoken to people inside the TV and film industry, and there has been this element. I'm not going to say that Squid Game is guilty of this, but there has been this idea that, you know, there's a checklist of things that you need to include into a modern K-drama or K-pop group to be successful. You know, you need to have a Southeast Asian element. You need to have something that references China. You need to have an international scene here to guarantee or to engage a bigger audience, right? And so that's definitely something that happens, but interestingly, it doesn't always prove to be successful. That's been in a lot of sort of producers and committees' mind. I think we need to include more people in order to be more profitable, more successful. But as you say, in you know, what Squid Game does do is it puts all these characters together. I mean, what else would be missing? An LGBT character, perhaps, or something like a single mother. But other than that, it seems to be going across a lot of hot button issues in Korean society, right? With the defectors, with the migrant workers, with the gangsters, and the people from elite universities, the bankers, and they're all shoved in there together in a Lord of the Flies situation. And, you know, just with some of those that I mentioned, it might be interesting to see what was omitted, because this was written about 10 years. This was written about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Before it was made. And so perhaps 10 years ago, like an LGBT character wasn't really the thing 10 years ago. Whereas if it was being made today, that might have come to the fore a little bit more. I'm not saying that would have made it better or worse, but I think it's interesting to see what was omitted from this list of characters.
Interesting that you say that, David. I watched this show. I binge watched it through the last week to get ready for this podcast. And I watched the last few episodes with a friend. And there is a gay element in this, or a LGBT element. And it's the foreigner when he is the horrible, sexually aggressive foreigner. And she said to me, and it's sunk in ever since, that perhaps because it was written so long ago and because of some of the attitudes that can exist in Korea, that they are compiling the immorality of foreigners and the disgustingness of that man, not just because he's foreign, but he was a particularly disgusting and vile kind of man. And of course, he also happens to be gay.
Yeah. You know, well done. So yeah, I was completely thinking about it from the Korean perspective. But yeah, there's that association with like decadence and sexual depravity, and it was for a long time in South Korea, sort of homosexuality, and that was associated with Western immorality and something that came from external sources, which is completely untrue, you know. But yeah. And with those characters, those VIP characters, we might get into it later, but I found it fascinating how so much of the online vitriol about their acting was sort of directed at, you know, these white people and things like that. But these characters were written by a Korean and they were directed by a Korean. It was a you know, a Korean person's portrayal of what, you know, these foreigners, these VIPs were like. And I think sometimes that gets a little bit missed, you know.
Let's get into that then, because this is interesting to me as well. I found this fascinating because I saw the same thing, and I saw it and I thought, well, yeah, that is badly acted and badly written. But of course, it's written by a Korean for a foreigner. But of course, and I think there should be some kindness given to that particular aspect of this. But on the other flip side of this, there's very little kindness being given to the subtitles, as in when the Korean show is made and twisted and for a Western audience to understand, there's been this whole uproar about the subtitles not quite being accurate. And I mean, I'm not sure how you see this, but on my side, this feels pedantic to me. My Korean is not good enough to do translation, but I've spoken to enough people who do translation for a living who say it's not about fidelity to the word, it's about fidelity to the meaning. And sometimes meaning can't translate because it takes sentences to explain a whole word. So how do you feel about that? Not just that dichotomy, but also that issue about the translation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's not just about fidelity, but the medium is also important. So it's not like translating a book or translating a poem where you have time. Here you have constraints in terms of it's got to scan really quickly. So that's another aspect of this. I think, like, if you watch Korean movies from 20 years ago or something, if you go and watch Memories of Murder, and the subtitles are terrible, like, you know, they're really bad. And they've come a long way since then, and they've come a long way because we have better skill. There's more sort of effort and money being put into people that do these jobs. There's more bicultural awareness. We've got like TCKs working in this field, and so that's a really good thing. I wrote about the subtitle issue really early on before it sort of blew up. But what I did was I didn't criticize the subtitles, actually. I just tried to take a couple of random ideas and just explain them. I didn't say the subtitles were bad. I didn't say that they were good. I just tried to say that there's a difference between what's being said and the subtitles. And so once you're aware of that, it might give you a better understanding of what's going on. And I got quite a few emails, actually, from people saying, oh, I never realized that. Thanks, really. You know, that's cool that you made that point. Thank you very much. So I think it's not so much about criticizing and expecting everything to be explained. It's just more of an awareness. And I think the subtitles are absolutely fine. I've also seen what's more shocking to me is people watch it dubbed. Like, and that's it blows my mind, because I've heard some of the dubbed examples of Squid Game. I've seen them online, and it just sounds like the most god-awful thing I've ever lent my ears to. And, you know, I have to listen to a lot of K-pop, so that says something. But, you know, some people are actually, Bong Joon-ho said people have got to get over that 1-inch barrier of subtitles. And he was absolutely right, because a lot of people are watching Squid Game dubbed. And that to me is a whole different conversation. Subtitles to me are fine. But I will say this, Jed, this is, I went and watched Hamilton, like a live screening of Hamilton. And in the second half, they put on the subtitles. And in the first half, we watched the first half of Hamilton with no subtitles. And in the second half, they put the subtitles on. And it was in English, so I didn't need the subtitles. But I found myself being drawn to reading them. And then because of that, I was not watching the faces. I was not watching the emotions. I was just kind of reading a script, even though I didn't need to. And so I don't like that about subtitles. We come to expect them, we demand them, and we start reading them. Does it detract, do you think, from watching stuff, from the emotions?
I have that problem a little bit. Yeah, it does steal my eyes away a touch, and it's like a constant fight in your mind of thinking, pay less attention to this and look up. And again, sometimes you watch a movie or a TV show, as you mentioned, it's in English, and the subtitles are in English as well. And it's a shocking thing when you realize you are reading each one, and when there's a little error, your mind ticks and says, "Oh, that's a mistake," and thinking, why do you care about this? You understand exactly what's going on. There's a lot going on. I mean, you wouldn't actually need a lot of subtitles in this particular show to understand exactly what is happening at most times, even in Squid Game, despite all the introduction. I bet you if you left it out, people would walk away having a very clear understanding of the morality, of the issues, of the game, of the characters, in internal feelings. It is all there. I think we miss just how much is on play in that physicality, because we're desperately trying to have someone tell us what is on play underneath. We prefer to be told something than to actually see it and understand it.
Very good. And we don't want to miss anything. You remember that ambiguity of like buying a record and you weren't sure what the people were singing or what the lyrics were, and you would you would misinterpret it, but then you could
go years singing the wrong lyrics to the favorite song you loved, right?
Absolutely. But that's a good thing. And you kind of went that. And we know that our minds don't perceive things absolutely correctly all the time. You know, we're fallible. And I think we're moving away from that fallibility where we want unambiguous, we want to know what every word is, and then that allow us to critique things more and dig into everything that's being said. But I prefer that element of interpretation, fallibility. Maybe that's just because I grew up like that, but I think there's something to be said for that way of engaging with art, because that's, you know, what we're doing in a sense.
So I'm holding my gunfire on the morality. I think that's going to be the most interesting part of this. So before we get there, let's talk about something which I think people must have in their minds. It's the one issue and the one theme in this that bashes you over the head, and that's inequality. And it sort of bleeds a little bit from those subtitles, because it's that foreign character in the show. So it's a Pakistani foreign worker, and there's a whole bunch of social issues and concerns that hold around certain people in this country, and some of the treatment of certain people in certain professions when they're overseas workers come into this. And the language he uses, people were furious about, again, in the translation. I suspect simply not understanding the rich honorifics that are there in Korean language, and how even the average person has to speak like this, or often does speak like this. But it does go to that deeper issue of the inequality. And I have to assume that the director was trying to drum this home into us and for people watching, that it is there, not just the inequality in terms of wealth, but inequality in terms of education. Of course, they talk a lot about the guy who went to Seoul National University. Seoul National University got a wonderful plug in this show every second line. Yes. And, you know, and his friend in the main character is completely uneducated, or he dropped out of high school. And again, this is here inside Korean society, this idea of, and again, all tied into it, this idea of hard work, of if you don't achieve something, you're just not working hard enough. You're just not getting there.
That idea of nolyok, right? And it's just effort. So it's not about working smarter. It's not about working more creative. It's not even about sort of expressing your fears or your worries. And that might be to mental health or any surrounding issues. It's just like work harder, work later. And that has been a recipe for South Korean success, though. Let's not forget it. It doesn't come without its costs, but South Korea didn't go from where it was to where it is now. I often have to stress to my students in the Korean studies class just how bad the situation was in South Korea, you know, during the 50s and 60s, and what it is now. That perspective is so important. And a lot of that success, for better and for worse, was achieved by that nolyok and that effort. So, but it was right for the time, perhaps, you know, and as the times change, they require different skills, they require different things. You touched on the character of Ali, and who is the representative of the sort of the immigrant worker in South Korea. And that's a really real thing. We've had more and more stories come out about how badly treated they've been, how deprived of, just the inhumane working conditions that they're put under. And then also more than that, the complete lack of respect that they face from society more broadly, just because of where they're from, the color of their skin and their language. That's slowly changing in South Korea. We see more of that coming into the press. I found the character of Ali really troubling in many ways because, first of all, I thought the acting was terrible. And I'm speaking about the acting here. I'm not speaking about the person or the groups, but I thought the acting of Ali, especially at the beginning, and that kind of really super deferential behavior to the the honorifics that you mentioned, I found it really uncomfortable. And it was just like, it would be interesting if the character was
he seems to be the only person in the show who doesn't recognize that his life is on the line.
Yeah, it was too much of a stereotype, too reliant on the Koreans and thankful to the Koreans and guilty of, violence in the past and physically deformed. And it didn't, like, I approve of the representation in a drama. And, I don't want to go out and pick faults in everything because it should have been done to a better standard. But me personally, I found the character of Ali just like, I felt it kind of reinforced ideas rather than challenged them. That's what I would say about it.
There's I've written down a couple of quotes here. I thought they're interesting here, and this goes to a lot. There's a point that so Ali becomes, I suppose, friends is not the quite word, but quite close with the guy who went to Seoul National University, who was meant to be our high-flying investment banker. And there's a phrase, they ask each other why they're in there. And they both say, for money, same as you. And there's this indication here that despite being incredibly rich one, or was incredibly rich, with a great job and everything you need, or incredibly poor, there's always this issue of needing a little bit more, and you're never going to escape from this. And of course, there's this really important moment where the doctor in the game is cheating effectively. He's cheating with some of the people that are running the game, and the guy in charge you think is a monster and probably is a moral monster of a certain kind, says to him, I really don't care that you're stealing and harvesting this person's organs. But this is the quote, you ruin the most important aspect of the game, equality. And it clearly is trying to smash something into the viewer's mind here, that it is unequal outside there. But in here, despite you're all going to, well, most all of you except for one are going to die, it's equal. You get to,
Is it? You agree with that? It's equal inside?
No, I actually don't. I actually think it's the same kind of inequality outside. It is sheer chance. So outside, what makes things unequal is not just, wealth or you get a good job. Most of it is chance and luck, chance of birth. If you're born in the wrong place, in the wrong family, in the wrong time, it's just all incredibly bad luck. And there's nothing more in these games that is more profound than how small chance events seem to swing everything. So it doesn't matter how well you perform, or how strong you are, or how smart you are, or how clever you are. It is chance that's going to get you in the end, it feels like.
Yeah, completely agree. Like with the bridge blowing up, and that's not fair. That doesn't treat everybody fairly, and the numbers that they pick. And yeah, I agree with that. I just want to jump back before it skips my mind, because I've been thinking about the character of Ali. Like, I know, and I worked with the Ministry of Justice on immigration programs and spent a lot of time researching and dealing with these issues. But I also know a lot of PhDs, professors, doctors from India, from Pakistan, from Vietnam, that are not only incredibly intelligent, but incredibly successful. And, it would be interesting for me to see those people represented like that in dramas, not fulfilling that kind of sidekick role of that emotional character that we're going to feel sorry for. So we'll get that in. But that kind of representation of Korean society as well. I think that would be interesting going forward. Ali could have been like an Ali that was the successful. So you take that sort of rich Seoul National University and an Ali, but switch them around, because there are Korean people that work like Ali, and there are people at Seoul National University that teach and that study, like, that do that as well. You know, they could be flipped as well, I think.
Yes, I think so, just as easily. And I suppose that indicates perhaps the decade-old writing process involved here as well. Let's talk suicide. South Korea is rich in suicide, and it is, I believe, the highest suicide rate in the developed world. And there is a suicide in, I think there's a couple of suicides. One obvious suicide in the game, outside of the game, when they're sleeping in their rooms. But you know, a couple of times in the game, people choose death, and they choose to die, which effectively is suicide, or in some cases, murder-suicide. And what interested me, and I think a lot of people didn't catch on to this, was a lot of people that went in, so they all have to choose to go into this game, which I think is an interesting theme that we'll come back to. But they're all at the brink of a place where many people in Korean society would contemplate suicide. So they're also, one of them is in incredible amount of gambling debt. One has stolen a certain amount of money. He's probably going to go to prison for a few years. Ali needs money for his family. North Korea needs money to get her family out of North Korea. They all need a certain amount of money, and they're completely desperate. They're completely hopeless. And because they're so desperate and so hopeless, they are riddled with guilt from obligations to their family. And I think a lot of Westerners watching this don't realize that the place that a lot of those characters were in was the step before suicide. And going into that room, they're almost certainly going to die. There's a chance that they actually solve their problem. So why not suicide in that way, then do it in the outside world?
It's a really good point. And there's, after the marbles game, the man commits suicide in the room, doesn't he? I think because his wife dies, I think. It's really hard to overstate just how serious the problem is in South Korea, and it's heartbreaking when you look at the statistics. It's like one of the highest in the OECDs. Suicide is one of the, I think it's still the leading cause of death for young people. Can you imagine a society in which the leading cause of death is not misadventure, it's not drugs, or it's not accidents, but it's suicide. Young people choosing to end their own life when they should be in their prime. And unfortunately, the topic of suicide only ever gets attention when a high profile person does it. And then everybody will focus on suicide for a week in the press, and then it will be swept under the covers. And instead we'll talk about missiles, and we'll talk about, these kind of things. But it's an ongoing problem. Now, I guess with suicide, there's two things I try to bring up here. One of them is related to media and films like this and the portrayal of suicide. But I think the other one is more conceptual. Now, I don't know, when you think of suicide, Jed, like just as a concept, what, I mean, growing up, I was told like, oh, if you commit suicide, you go to kind of limbo or purgatory or these kind of things. It was, just in the environment that I grew up. But what is suicide, Jed, for you? Like, is it a self-affirming decision? Is it a bad thing? How do you view it?
I didn't grow up in a religious environment or a religious family, so didn't have any of those connotations. But somehow in my life, it didn't slip me by, but it always just seemed to be an error. And clearly it is a mistake. I don't mean it in that sense. It is an error to imagine that the horrible things you've done are not the end. It's not that things will not get slowly better afterwards. I haven't said that though. Haven't said that. I've always struggled to personally understand it, despite reading a lot of work by people like Durkheim on suicide. I haven't said that. It has a romance, and you can't get away from this. It has a romance to it. Every time someone like Kurt Cobain kills himself, or some singer kills themselves at a young age, it is saying to the world in a way, I'm almost too cool for this. I'm better than this. Or I have the courage to extract myself from the only thing that I could possibly care about. Everything I could possibly care about, all my experiences or loves or hates or whatever you want, must be in this consciousness. And you're deciding to never have that consciousness again. So yeah, I've struggled with the place I find myself, and with someone who, I can never imagine myself ever getting into a place. And I know some people really can imagine it quite easily. But I know when someone kills themselves, despite it's more than an error, it can be, and it certainly can be a way to reclaim something. And I'm a little bit lost for words as in how I should say it, because even saying that, I think to myself, you don't want to be telling young people or anyone out there listening that, in fact, this has a positive value to it. But it certainly seems to have a value, and it certainly has this is the error I think that exists within Korean society, is that I think even if individuals say there's no value to it here, I think as a culture, it does value suicide, and it values it as a cleanser and a cathartic and a washing away of moral sins and something that can actually add a benefit. I'm not sure how you see it, Ledoux.
It's fascinating to hear you express that, because there is, from Camus onwards, that, like, suicide is the only real philosophical question, and to be or not to be, from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And there is that kind of romantic aspect of it, like with Kurt Cobain, or you see Mark Fisher, the British cultural theorist, and it's like, well, I'm too good for this world, I'm too cool, or it's the Hunter S. Thompson way. But that's one way of looking at it. Now, sometimes in different cultures, words, concepts, ideas, they reverberate differently. So, of course, you have family in the West and you have family in Korea, and family is just family. But sometimes it means different things. Sometimes 가족 is a little bit different from family. And sometimes the word we or uri, they resonate differently. And I think there's a different, I don't mean to orientalize or anything like that, but I think there's a different way that suicide is sometimes understood in South Korea, and that it's understood and used as a symbol of protest. And this has quite a long history. You can find lots of different examples of this, where suicide is seen as a way of sending a message and drawing attention to a plight. So it's not always an individual act like this, I'm checking out because, I'm too good for this place, or I have my own individual problems. And there are those elements in South Korea, let's be real about it. But there is also this idea of, there's a problem going on, there's something in society, and I want more attention to be drawn to it. And so I'm going to sacrifice myself. It's going to be a protest suicide in order for this to happen. And the more and more you read about South Korean examples of that, you'll see it, whether it's from John Tae-il onwards, but this kind of martyrdom. And I think, when you hear about the patriotic martyrs, the Olisas and the Yolsas, and is the martyrdom played up and because it's a real part of South Korean society, or are these played up and then it has the effect of causing more people to choose that way because they think it's noble, because they think it's honorable? Now, like in Squid Game, you have Gi-hoon talking about his friend dying in the motor strike, and that was a real thing in 2009, and many people committed suicide as a result of that, and it's a common thing for that to happen. So that's the first point, whether suicide in Korea is different from suicide elsewhere because it's more associated with protest. I think there's something in that. The second thing that I would like to make about suicide is the role of media. Now, you asked me at the start about Korean dramas and movies, and one of the things that slowly started shocking me was when I saw how many Korean movies and dramas feature the good guy or the good girl committing suicide. And I'd never seen this before, because in the West, the good guy doesn't commit suicide. The good guy survives, or the good guy gets the girl. The good guy picks up the flag, But I saw so many of the noble characters in Korean movies and dramas choosing to commit suicide. And that was seen as noble. And once I started seeing this, and this is in the character Chief of Staff, the big noble character decides to jump off a roof because that's what the noble thing to do was. At the end of JSA, Lee Byung-hun's character commits suicide. It's in so many things. Now, the suicide in these movies and dramas, is it reflecting real life and it's a portrayal of society, or is it the other way round? And these glamorous suicides of noble people, then people watch that in society and go, well, then I'm going to do that as well. Do you get the point that I'm making? My
instinct is that it is the other way around. I mentioned Durkheim before, and he is the guy who first spoke about the addictive nature of suicide. So, right. A boy, BTS breaks up tomorrow, and no one commits suicide if there's no first person to commit suicide. But as soon as one girl, one young boy commits suicide, the rest look at it, and there's a copycat phenomena in this. And it seems strange to imagine that something as profound and as damaging and destructive of life as suicide can actually have this peer pressure almost about it, or a following kind of aspect to it. But it really does work. The best way to predict how much the suicide a society is going to have is to see how much exists, and they're simply going to follow it as a trend. I suspect it is that it has existed. So I'm assuming it first came around with some bad moral ideas, which I think still exist in some circles today. For all the people that say suicide is terrible, what did they say when the owner of the company of the Saywal killed himself? I saw all those people smiling, saying, well, he did a good thing. How could he have lived with his shame? As in, I think a lot of people who say suicide is horrible, don't really mean it in the sense they just think it's horrible if it happens to me or someone I love or some young girl or boy who can grow up. But if someone's actually done a huge moral sin, then yeah, it's right for them to die in a way. My instinct that it is culture driven media rather than media driven culture, though once tied together, yeah, I'm sure things speed up quite dramatically.
I think that's probably the most sensible way to look at it, that they're influencing each other in sort of a dual causal way. It's not a chicken or an egg, but yeah, both of them together. And yeah, Durkheim's, that kind of social fact created sui generis, that idea, completely with it. Just one last idea for you on this suicide. And yeah, we've said that suicide in South Korea is so high, tragically high, and not enough attention is placed on it. And we don't have the exact statistics, but I would probably imagine that more people in South Korea commit suicide than in North Korea, Jed.
Yes, almost certainly.
What does that mean then?
I think it seems to be a phenomenon that happens all around the world, actually, this. When you go to certain societies, there's just very little suicide that exists within them. And when you go to very poor societies where suffering is a part of life, suicide rarely crosses the minds of the people. They're in the trenches, so to speak, fighting to stay alive. And the idea of not fighting to stay alive is this horrible, it's just something that simply doesn't cross the mind, is antithetical to everything that they do every day. Why suffer? I think it speaks towards the fact that this is a cultural thing, and often suicide. This language I'm about to use is the wrong language, but I think it is. It's hard to say it another way. It has an indulgence to it. Some of it. I mean, there's 3 different types of suicide in the Squid Game, which I'll mention in a second. But sometimes someone kills themselves because the boy band broke up, and you think, what the hell were they doing? And really, that what they've done in their minds in that situation is imagine that the end of BTS, whatever boy band that breaks up, is the greatest catastrophe that's ever going to come around, which means they actually don't know what real suffering is. They haven't experienced an awful lot of pain in their life. They don't know what it means to not know where your next meal is coming from, or they don't know what it means to not be able to buy things, or they don't know what it means to know that the wrong word will bring your death in some way. There is a level of suicide of that kind, and where it becomes this phenomena such as it is in South Korea, I think, where it's hard to look at it in any other way. And I'll throw this back to you and I'll add something. I think there's 3 suicides in the game that I can think of. One is the man in the room, so in the TV show. So he actually has to kill his wife or beat his wife at a game. And I'm assuming, and then he kills himself that night. I'm assuming that is a guilt kind of thing. He just cannot live with the guilt of what he has done, or even a potential protest because he wants to leave the game at that time. So the protest you're speaking about. But there's 2 other suicides. One is the angry middle-aged woman who kills the gangster as a type of revenge. So this is simply, well, to hell with it. I'm so pissed off at you that I'll kill you and I'll take myself with it. But the most interesting one was the young girl who kills herself. So she is playing marbles against a North Korean lady. And she says to her, tell me about your life. And the North Korean lady starts telling her about all the suffering that she's been through and all the horrors and her family up north in North Korea. And then this young girl eventually says, well, I just got out of prison. And it wasn't as if she's some horrible criminal. There are really horrible reasons for why she was in there, and bad luck came her way. But she chooses to die. And her choice is, You have more to live for. You have a more important life than mine. It's a deeply moral decision to die. And it comes from the convict, the prisoner in the game, which I thought was a fascinating look at this, and weighed it against the person in the game who probably suffered more than everyone else that we can imagine, which is the North Korean defector.
Mm. The suicides all come across quite, noble. The man is quite tragic, but the Han Min-yo, when she takes the Doksu off the bridge, and then the young girl that you're just talking about they're they, just hearing you describe them now, they come across rather poetic. They come across as chivalrous. They come across as you say, the moral thing to do. And so when I hear you describe it in those ways, but then I also place it next to the reality of the statistics in South Korea, and you suggest that this is a cultural phenomenon, that this is something that's created by culture, then is it, I'm not suddenly suggesting that there should be some kind of Park Chung-hee control over content, but do you not think that then there should be sort of some effort, like, to address it? Yeah.
Yes, I think there should be much more. I mean, there's two ways to imagine why someone would kill themselves. One is there's a certain threshold of pain and suffering that any human gets to, and they kill themselves. One is you have a horrible gamble on your mind and a horrible amount of guilt from something you've done. And the other one is you are simply imagining a horrible amount of guilt, and you're imagining a horrible amount of suffering, when that is just not it's not objective. And of course it's hard to, you cannot have an objective standard, but you are imagining small things to be the worst tragic things in life. And some young kid who's struggling to get into university, whose family's put all his pressure in their life on him and saying, you must succeed for us, and he's struggling, he can't get the marks, he knows he's not going to get into Seoul National University, and he kills himself. This is, don't get me wrong, this is it feels like the end of the world for that guy, but we all know it's not. We all know that despite all the horrors and pains that are going to be pushed upon him, he will continue. He will get better each day, and it'll be difficult, but it is not the same as for example, the woman from North Korea. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the tragedies of South Korea that you have so much suicide and so little attention being paid to it, which is really strange, because as soon as some other problem happens, as soon as Japan says something about a 7-year-old war crime, everyone is up in arms. But you could have, a mass of teenagers saying, I just don't want to live in this society anymore. And people shrug their shoulders. Or what I suspect is more in line with it, they have a cultural theory in their mind that says, I just shouldn't speak about this. It's better if we stay quiet.
Definitely that second point. I was on the radio the other day talking about mental health issues and suggesting, that when you have a physical ailment, you go to a doctor, and just like that, when you have a mental one, you should do a similar thing. One of the listeners actually took the time to message into the radio station while we were talking and saying, as a Korean, I think that if you have a mental health problem, it's better not to talk about it because society will judge you negatively. So you should keep it to yourself. And I found that fascinating that someone would actually, take the time and effort to message in and say, like, I appreciate what you guys are doing on the radio, but as a Korean, my advice is don't do it. And, it's not my position to tell them that they're wrong, right? That's their opinion. But there's definitely that idea of which should not be spoken. And that's even a euphemism that they use in the press, right? They call it an extreme choice.
Yeah.
It's even like the word is difficult to say sometimes. So
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast and you listen regularly and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode.
I think that bleeds us into the morality of this. And I think the first question on this, the first point we're going to get to here is, and it does come from the suicide. It's that when you start watching the show, the central character is this horribly reprehensible person. He's gambling away his money, and he seems completely flippant about the concerns of his family. But it's very quickly you realize, and this is the case for almost all of them. I'm not sure about the gangster. I'm not sure about the middle-aged woman, but almost all of them, it comes through that they are good guys and girls who are doing bad things with their lives. But underneath it all, they're still good. And there's almost a deliberate attempt to change your love of all the characters here, and a message coming through. And I think this is the important moral message here. And it's the kind of thing that probably gets people away from suicide if they can internalize this message. And that is, we are all much more than the worst things we have done.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, we are much...
So, you've done something horrible, such as get yourself into the amount of debt. This is that guy from Seoul National University. He's got himself into this horrible amount of debt. If mum is going to lose her shop as a result, he's going to go to prison for a few years. But it doesn't, that shouldn't define him as a moral person. It's simply a mistake. He's made what he has done is for whatever reason he has got there, it is a moral mistake. It is not a defining mistake. It's not something that should say who he is. He is much more than those errors he makes. So such as someone else in the game, like our convict. Yeah, she's much more than being a murderer. And our central character is much more than a gambling addict and an alcoholic. But it's very hard to get people past those things in the moment when you really are wallowing in those horrible places, to imagine that you are more than that. And I think that was a real central moral theme in Squid Game, to try and let everyone know that, yeah, everyone is a morally flawed person. And it's not a defining aspect of it, or it shouldn't be.
That's a really good way of looking at it, I guess. Yeah. And there's the redemption of Gi-hoon, right? And because you're completely correct. He starts off absolutely stealing from his mother,
yes.
Gambling and unable to provide for his daughter who he's separated from. And it's really uncomfortable to watch. And then that all plays out with him while everybody else sort of dies by the wayside. If we are speaking about the morality of Squid Game, I found it a little on the nose. I mean, there was this idea that, you're a bad person, but like Gi-hoon, the character, you might be a bad person and you've done all these things, but if you're a nice guy, right, and if you help others, and if you help the old man, and he's wed himself, and if you speak nice to immigrant people, and if you do these things, that eventually you'll succeed and there's a happy ending. And don't worry about the money. Just be good and you'll become really rich, or you won't care about the money. And I thought it was a lovely message, but nothing particularly original. And I also wonder if it's a little bit sort of dangerous as well, because it keeps people in that state. Don't worry about the money, by the way. If you're really poor, don't worry about the money. Just be nice to people. And I just wonder if it engenders passivity, or making people passive. And, because if you want to exist in a capitalist society, you will have to earn some money. Kindness will not pay your bills in the society that we live in, unfortunately. I'm not saying that we should be driven by money, but I found it, it was very didactic in what it wanted to say. And I'm not sure that it was particularly original or thought-provoking. And I think there might even be a little bit of sort of danger in that message that it gives.
I can see that danger, but I suspect, I might come from a different angle here. I suspect what they're doing, in the writing of the show, is trying to show that the money does matter. It's clearly, it's there, it's hanging over everyone's head, and if they all had money, they wouldn't be in the room. I suspect what they're trying to say is money is important, but it is the absolute obsession with money which is the problem, and is the absolute obsession with the money that forces people to be so immoral and to there's a moral kind of principle here of once you've committed a certain amount of immorality, the next immorality just doesn't feel so bad. In fact, it feels like the obvious right thing to do. And I've never been a gambler, but this is what a lot of the people in that show, they're all there gambling with their life. And the central character is a gambler. The guy from Seoul National University is effectively gambling. And I'm assuming that a part of this is to show from the other aspect, and the other angle of this is once you've, the real problem is to go chasing money and to cheat and to lie and to take shortcuts to get it. And one of the problems is the hole you get into once this begins to go in the wrong direction. It's like a whirlpool. You must, once you've lost all your savings, well, you really have to go and borrow money to then try and win them back, because you can't go home to your wife. Once you've lost that loan, you really have to go get another loan and win back your savings and the loan. And I suspect one of the issues is simply that it's that desperate chase for the money, which is the problem here.
That's a very valid point. And I will say that money doesn't interest me in the slightest, but my question would be at this point, is it possible to, because I think Squid Game would suggest not, but is it possible to be driven by money, to be successful, and to be moral?
Yes.
So you know, you want to be rich, you know, you find, well, I want to be rich because I want to have a lot of money and I want to have nice things and I want to provide for my family. I don't want them to live in want, and I'm not going to settle for middle class. I want 5-star. And so I'm driven by having money so I can afford these things. And the person is actually successful in doing that. And they do it morally without, you know, succumbing to cheating or swindling or offshore Panama bank accounts and things like that. Is it possible to do that, Jed?
I think it absolutely must be, but unless you are imagining that when I get to a certain amount of money, then this is the place where I've had enough, because that is obviously never going to come. And I imagine there's a scene at the end of this where he comes home. He's just won the game, so he's won exactly 50 million US dollars at the end of the game, and he comes home and his wife, his mother, is dead on the floor. And I'm assuming that is a message of you're out there chasing this money, and while you are, life is slipping away, and the things that actually matter are slipping away. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to try and accumulate as much wealth as you can in your life. But I think the problem is most people think, when I get this amount of wealth, then I can stop. And the point is, they want to stop. They just don't have enough wealth yet. And I think that is the real challenge.
Yeah, that is the opportunity cost, I think, because you know, he could have been at home with his mother spending the time, you know, but it was the chasing money. So it's the time, you know, we have a very short space of time here. And Tolstoy wrote that, how much land does a man need, you know, and the idea is that we all need the same amount of land, because when we're dead, we all take up the same amount of space, you know, we all go to the same place, right? So yeah, I agree with that. But I sometimes get a little bit, I find it problematic when we get this idea that rich people are always immoral and poor people are sort of this kind of salt of the earth thing. And there's this great romanticism in that idea. But in my experiences, I haven't found it to be true. There are good and bad rich people and successful people, and there are good and bad not, you know, that kind of, it's that Robin Hood story that keeps coming back, and it's great when you're a kid, but I don't think it really reflects real life, and it creates incorrect images of what's actually going on sometimes.
Yes, I agree with you on that, actually. I think it's absolutely true. I think it's always incredibly distasteful when someone imagines someone who is wealthy when they're not, or has what they have. But I think that's the error they're making. They're thinking, if this person just gave me some more, then I'd get to the level that I need, without recognizing that that person may be happy not because of the money, but because of the job they have, the problems they're solving each day to get the money, or the things that they can do with the money. And there's a point in this game. Let's dig into the morality some more here. And you must have noticed it. I think it's on the second or third day of the game. They stopped giving the prisoners so much food, and it suddenly breaks out into a Hobbesian war of all, you know, life is suddenly already bloody, brutal, and short, and they start killing each other outside of the game because they recognize that they don't actually have to go out and compete against everyone. They can just kill everyone inside the room. And all it takes is for there to be a little less resources available to them. And suddenly it breaks out. It's like a tragedy of the commons in a microscope, just exploding in front of our eyes. So I wonder what you thought about that.
It's the idea, I guess, that the financial incentives create a structure that provides order. Without that, it just descends. When there's scarcity, as you say, it becomes this nasty, brutish, and short Lord of the Flies idea, where it descends into murder. And is that really what happens? Well, some people take the idea that we have this, I don't know if it's the correct term to use, like this noble savage, that without money and without these things, that we would all actually sit around and share, and we would produce, and we would sing Kumbaya. And then other people take a much, sort of darker view of life, that Hobbesian, that realist view, and that it would be a dog eat dog. I'm not sure that I could actually answer what would happen when you take those things away, because I believe that there is the possibility that it doesn't have to be Hobbesian. I believe that there is a possibility that people, I'm not saying it would be utopian or angelic, but I believe there is a possibility that you take all of those things away and you provide scarce resources, and people then might say, well, okay, well, let's get through this together somehow. I think history would show you some examples of that happening, and perhaps that we're pushed into this fear that without the structures, without the capitalism and the financial incentives to push us, that we will just descend into anarchy. And I'm just curious whether that is true. It's a great nightmare to have in front of you, and you don't want to ever run that risk with millions of people, just in case Hobbes was right. But what do you think, Jed? Do you think if we take everything away that we do descend into that? Or do you think that there is a possibility that no, human nature is inherently cooperative, moral, conscious, and it could go the other way?
This is really actually very interesting, I think. I agree it can be like that, but I also think that we overestimate our ability to cooperate. Now, I think it has to be the future. If we want a more moral future, it's going to have to us, making moral progress each and every day, fighting along and fighting those horrible instincts inside us. But I think often people that have never had to do it are very easy to dismiss the fact that this is inside them all. And a central aspect of the game is just how quickly ethics break down in warfare, for example. Suddenly your life is on the line. So that game of marbles was an incredibly gripping episode, I found, where people are, they're playing their friends and they're cheating their friends suddenly because they realize you are my best friend in this game. We're buddies in the trenches, and then suddenly it's either me or you that has to survive, and I can cheat and win, and they all start to cheat and to win. And I think morality can overcome, moral progress can change anything within our biology. I'm confident of that. But just how hard it is to erase that biological instinct to survive at every and all cost, it's not such an easy thing to do. And I'm sure that the director made a very conscious choice where there is one character who it's the young North Korean girl. And she tells the main character, who's about to go and kill the bad guy, who is at that point the guy from Seoul National University. She calls him back and says, "Don't do it. You're not that kind of person." I think that's the quote. And, it immediately gets her killed. The bad guy comes across when this moment is available, and he kills her. And I think I think the director is showing that, and he's trying to tell us this. And I think too often we simply imagine that our ethics shouldn't degrade. As soon as some soldier commits a horrible war crime, we think, of course we should punish him, and of course we should. But we often think, I would never do it. When the truth is, you probably would if the right horrible circumstances were applied to you. And I think that's something that was missed after all those horrible atrocities from history, such as the Holocaust and things like that. Too often we look back and say just how bad they were, when the real moral message is, look how bad we can all become with just a few significant pressures in our life.
It's absolutely true. And, you know, we always imagine ourselves that we would be the one standing up to the oppressive force. We would be the one in Tiananmen Square. We would be the one standing up against Auschwitz, when it could very well easily be the other way. And we might get caught up in these things. Yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. But then I think what we're doing, that decision by Sebyok, by the North Korean defector, to stop Gi-hoon, like killing his rival right at the end, you know, she saves him from becoming a murderer, and in doing so she loses her own life, right? And it's this sacrifice, and
so continues the trend of South Korean movies and TV shows showing North Koreans as being morally upstanding people, perhaps even more morally upstanding than South Koreans as well. There's a line she says, she's asked, why did you come south? And she says, I thought it would be good down here. And I think there's a lot of that indication within South Korean movies and film.
That's a complete legal question that came in with Crash Landing on You and this portrayal, right? Of whether it's good or bad, whether you're allowed to do that, and what sort of message it sends. Because I've been fascinated by the fact that YouTube and Twitter take down all the North Korean vlogs that they make up there. You know, they deny us that access to their information. But going back to this question of what would happen if you take away all the resources, and well, I think we need to also then apply, you know, whether we turn into Hobbesian or we go into more liberal, but it's dependent on culture, isn't it? If we this idea that we're all the same, that we all think the same, that we're all rational decision makers guided by free will. You know, I'm all we're biological things, but you said it yourself earlier that culture does play a role in this. It plays a role in suicide. It plays a role in some aspects of our lives. So I think we shouldn't just approach that in terms of biological impulses to either kill or be killed, or to all come together and work towards a better thing. But I think culture plays a role, and we all, you know, it's about creating a culture or promoting a culture if that's what we want, you know.
I agree, actually. I think culture plays the most significant role in this. And I know that you enjoy Nietzsche, and there's a point in this where I kept thinking, oh, Nietzsche would be happy right now. And that is the moment just after what we're talking about, where the guy from Seoul National University, who is now the ruthless bad guy, comes across and he kills the young girl while she can't stand up. And of course, the good guy on the other side of this is livid and yelling at him and screaming at him and saying, why did you do that? I could have saved her. And I wrote down the quote, and this is what the bad guy says: that's why I killed her. I know you, because you would have given everything to save her. And he's trying to say in that moment, don't think that I'm immoral because I killed someone in cold blood. It had to be done. Only one of us can win this game. What on earth do you think we're doing here? And it struck me as very Nietzschean, this idea of, do you have the will to power? This idea of you must reject this whenever you feel too much compassion and pity, and it's stopping you making what is the only choice you can make. Because at some point, if he was going to win that game, the good guy, the young girl was going to have to die. And it's a Nietzschean kind of Übermensch, this idea of, do you have the guts? Do you have it inside you to do what you know you must do?
It's fascinating insight. Yeah, that's a really great way of looking at that scene. And you make me think, wouldn't Squid Game have been so much better if the last two characters were Gi-hoon and Sebyok?
Yes.
You know, yes. Because that's like Squid Game's really good, but you know from the start, like I was watching it with my wife, my sister-in-law, and they were getting very what would you say? Not frustrated, but very tense and they were feeling all this pressure about what was going to happen to this guy. And I just kind of said to them, like, don't worry, he's going to live. Like, yes. And it could have been, you know, if you really wanted to do the morality of this, it would have played out completely differently. I mean, if we want to apply real life and we want to get all of these things going in, it wouldn't have been Gi-hoon, the character that gets to the end. Or if we wanted to make some, you know, a really powerful statement with something, you would have had Gi-hoon and Sebyok, you would have had the main character and then the North Korean defector, a man against a woman at the end. Rather than this, you know, it would have been more Empire Strikes Back than Return of the Jedi, you know, and we all know which people one think is the best Star Wars movie.
Yes, yes. And I think that is an important, you just mentioned women. Women get a bad rap in this movie, despite in this TV series, despite being often the most powerful and strong-willed characters there. There's an endless discussion about, no, we really don't want women on our team because they are weak. This gets repeated an awful lot. I'm not sure if that stung your ears as much as as mine, but I kept thinking we are meant to get this into our minds. He's trying to tell us that Korean society still treats women as these weak things that, yeah, if you have to have them on your team, then fine, or you have to have them in your life, then fine. But they are an emotional and survival anchor that's going to drag you down eventually.
Yeah, there was that. There was quite a lot of this. No, I won't say there was a lot, but there was some of this commentary in the Korean language press that I haven't seen really come over into the English language press as much, but about the portrayal of women and also the use of sex. So Han Min-yo, the kind of middle-aged character that kills the gangster when she jumps off, you know, she's seen often trying to use her sexuality to survive, and you know, that's seen as demeaning. I guess we have to remember that portrayal doesn't mean promotion, you know, that it's showing these ideas is not showing them because it endorses them, but because it's trying to reflect a little bit of that. And maybe it's that 10-year gap. Maybe it would be different. Maybe if it was made today, there might be a female lead character, or it might be shown differently. A couple of other
quick questions on consent and morality, because you know, I paid a lot of attention to this. A very important scene at the start. I'm not sure how you saw this, but the consent of the characters to be in this horrible game. 456 characters, and only one can survive at the end. And, you know, after the first day, so they will choose to go knowing that it's going to be pretty bad. And after the first day, when they know what it is, they will leave. And I thought this was an important part of the TV show. They all say, I want out. They can vote and leave. And they did. And then they were given the option to return. And 93%, I think, was the number they gave, return. And it must be trying to tell us that consent is important here. And a lot of the horrors and, you know, terrible things that happen in our lives that we think are completely intolerable are things that we consent to. In a way, you know, you're in a bad relationship, for example, but you just you just won't leave your wife or your girlfriend, your husband, or whatever, because it's hard not to. But you easily could. You're in a bad job, and you could easily quit your job. But you know, it might be hard and some difficult and some insecure years ahead of you trying to find a better job. And I think I really did like that moral message there. That there is an awful lot of consent within the worst things that happen to us, and a lot of suffering in our life are things we consent to without realizing often that we are.
Indeed, but I would also come at this another way, Jed, and perhaps say that sometimes we consent to things, but we don't have any other choice. You know, like if you have money, then you are free in a certain sense. But if you don't have money, you will consent to a whole many things that you wouldn't consent to otherwise, perhaps. And that might be in your career choices, that might be in your relationship choices, in financial choices. So I agree that there is always that choice that happens, but how free that choice is, I think it must exist on a spectrum between sometimes being 100% free, sometimes being at the end of a barrel of a gun. And then there's a whole spectrum in between where people, you know, you could say that they were making their own free choice, but then we also need to understand that the pressures on those people when they are making those choices, and then how free are they?
Yes, which is another indictment of sorts on an increasingly modern Korean, modern and wealthy Korean society that has so much suicide and so much suffering, and people who think they don't have choice. The more wealth that Korea seems to get, the more trapped people feel in their lives, which is a dichotomy. Because I really do, I actually agree with you. You actually have a lot less choice and consent when you are poor. Of course, you still have it. No one's forcing you to do anything, at least in some horrible situations in the world. But completely rich, wealthy, or at least affluent people often think, I am trapped. I had to marry that guy. I had to take that job. I had to study that course. And the reality is, no, you really didn't. It was just going to be hard. You're going to suffer if you didn't do it. Your family was going to be all over you. It was going to cost you something in terms of pain and guilt. And you chose the easy way out of this. Sorry, you chose the way out of it that didn't affirm your own life, but affirmed someone else's.
Right. This is going a little bit of a tangent, but it's just listening to you say that, it's where my mind goes, is particularly about this idea of choices and the people that chose to leave and then chose to go back in. Squid Game doesn't really deal, I don't think, maybe I missed it, you might have notes on it, the idea of like socialism and collective power. When you're thinking for yourself and your own individual plight, that's where that leads. That's where Squid Game leads. But we know, it was about the majority. If everybody got together and had that collective action in Squid Game, we never saw that play out, or what the possibilities were there. And that would have saved all that death. That would have saved all that fighting. That would have saved, all the tragedies that unfolded would have been averted had all of those people decided, well, hang on, let's do this together. We can all press this button. I forget whether it's the red or green, probably green. Let's all press this button together. Okay. And then we all live. And then everyone had gone, yeah, okay, now we all live. Now we're all living and we're all together and we're a couple of hundred people. Now what can we do? Can we pool our efforts and do something and create something? We're not going to create a conglomerate or a chaebol straight off the bat, but, together, what can we achieve? Can we even take down the people with the guns? Can we go back out into the real life and live together in a commune, or pull together our social services? Or do you see what I mean by
yes,
this idea that it's all driven by individual choices rather than that collective nature? And it could have gone a completely different way. And I'm sure if there was a Russian or Chinese Squid Game, it might have looked different.
Yes, and I think that is, we didn't mention before, but that is the enduring moral of the tragedy of the commons there, right? It seems like this game is pitted to make you compete and to be violent and to trick and to cheat. But the real game, if you all cooperate, it means you all do quite well in this. It's just the instinct to let everyone else cooperate while you continue to cheat them, which is the challenge here. And I thought that was an enduring message there. And of course, they all quickly split into teams. But the trouble is, and to have a certain amount of cooperation inside the game, the trouble is, as soon as they split into teams, it becomes deeply tribal. It's the immorality of the other team breeds immorality in them. The violence of the other team breeds violence in them, and it all spirals in. And they seem to have hatred for the other person simply by, again, the chance that they ended up on the wrong team. So even their cooperation, so narrowly defined, brought the worst possible outcomes for them.
So if you put this is going to be the wrong person. You put a Greta Thunberg in there. You put a Churchill in there. You put a Hitler in there. You put someone with immense charisma and force of will and personality, right? To bend people, to bend a mass to their way of thinking. And we know it can be done for good and for bad. But that's something that I would like to see played out in that kind of Squid Game. What if you do get people together, right? And then what happens? What could be done? So, yeah.
It does require that the person doing the bending keeps their morality straight, though, right? at the same time for it to be a good outcome. So there are a couple of moments when people do bend the morality of others to themselves, to full cooperation. The gangster develops this group of people around him that start calling him boss, of course, as they would. But of course, it's not a moral group, and he starts betraying them. And there is a certain amount of moral bending, as in when the guy from Seoul National University betrays Ali, which I think was way too overplayed. There's no way Ali, no matter how simple they want to portray the guy in the show as, he's not walking away and leaving his marbles behind, knowing that that's the thing that's going to save him. But this was the guy from Seoul National University bending his morality, saying let's cooperate, and we'll beat everybody else just to simply steal and cheat, which is, of course, where all the great communist and socialist movements fall down. The person at the top never manages to keep their morality in line.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely, doesn't it? I think that's
yes.
Acton that comes into this. Yeah, it requires that. There's this one point that I want to hit before we perhaps run out of time. Can we move on to a next one?
Yes, please. Yeah.
This is to do with catharsis, and I'm not sure how you'll feel with this, so I'll just explore the idea here. But it's something that, everyone's talking about Squid Game because it's part of the Korean wave and that, but also it deals with economic inequality, and we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a lot of the economic inequality. Some companies have got even richer than before, delivery companies and courier things, while many people have suffered. And this has widened the gap, and it's drawn attention to the great economic inequality that exists not just in South Korea, but many societies around the world. And some people will say that's why this has resonated, and it's been Netflix's #1. Now, my worry, or what I would like to talk about with you, is the idea that while economic inequality is a real problem, we're all going to watch Squid Game. We're all going to see the issues raised of capitalism. Oh yeah, it's capitalism. It's a rat race. It's what we do. We're going to read a couple of articles. We're going to post about it on social media. And then we're going to be absolved of all those feelings. We're going to have this cathartic release because we've watched a drama. But in real life, nothing actually gets done. So these dramas, this Squid Game has the absolute opposite of effect on what we actually would want if we want to solve economic inequality. Because if we want to solve something like that, whether we do or not, I would suggest yes, but we need real attention drawn to it, and we need action, and progress has to be made. But my worry is that by watching this, people feel that they've actually done something. They feel relieved of that frustration, relieved of that pressure, and then we move on to something else. And so do you get the point? I'm not sure if my point's clear.
No, yeah, I got it. Yeah. No, yes. I was thinking the same thing watching, and it's that thing of it is what is Marx's quote? The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The real problem is to try and change it. That's not really the problem. Is that trying to change things and do things is incredibly dirty job to try and get your hands in. It takes you, it's not to say that creating a moral theory is not incredibly difficult. Of course it is, and it's often the most important thing. But it's one thing to say, I want to help climate change. I mean, I'd like to end climate change. You ask me, what am I doing about it? Absolutely bugger all. No, I recycle and I do a few things, but I cannot pretend that I am making any deep commitment to this, or any commitment worthy of the size of the cause. And I suspect an awful lot of people who do this, who speak about a lot of moral causes, don't do anything. It's as if by speaking about something enough and having enough people look at you as you are speaking, then they recognize that you really want this thing to change. And therefore you're beyond challenge, you're beyond question, because you are professing it so loudly. And that profession must in some way in their minds bleed into the idea that you are doing something, when in fact you're doing nothing. It's like if you go back to Squid Game, it's like vacationing in someone else's suffering in a way.
Yeah.
Instead of going there, it's peering into their suffering, but not wanting to actually feel the pain. It's wanting to gamble with your life, but you don't actually want to take the risk. It's completely vicarious pornography, and we all get in this. It's an easy trap to fall into, and it is deeply cathartic if you just pay attention to your emotions. Sometimes, if you just think about doing good things, you feel like a more moral person simply by getting trapped in this. And I've seen some psychological studies that do the same thing. You think about doing something terrible, or you think that someone may have perceived you in a bad way, you go in a spiral in the opposite direction. And yeah, my instinct is that we should have shows like this, and we should do more about this. But I'm not sure how. I guess my question back to you is, I'm not sure what the alternative is, because if you got rid of a representation like this, then what you lack now is the focus on the issue, I suspect. Now, you can fill in that focus in other ways, but I'm not, it's a tricky place to find yourself, because I recognize that there is a certain amount of distraction that comes from this and false satisfaction. But I'm stuck when I think about what the alternative should be. And I'm always loath to tell people you shouldn't make that type of art, even if it is damaging.
Yeah. And so, first of all, I'm glad that you understand the point that you know, this might, and it's not so much about other people or signaling virtue, but it's about our own feelings, that we feel that by watching Squid Game, we have in some way contributed to the betterment of society vis-a-vis economic inequality, which I don't necessarily think is true. I think it can sort of, and then we move on to something else, right? And so I think that can be dangerous. Now, I agree with you. I don't think that we should be suggesting that we shouldn't be making this art, or I don't know what the suggestion or the alternatives are to this problem, but it worries me that we get into this slacktivism, this idea that we will, and when I mentioned this to some other people, when I was exploring this idea, they were saying, well, are you saying it's like a conspiracy by these Netflix companies to, you know, make us all not pay attention? I don't think so, right? I'm not suggesting that, but it is always these huge multi-million-dollar corporations that are producing the anti-capitalist material. And that there is something in there that needs to be unpeeled a little bit more. And, you know, when I mentioned at the start, the worrying thing was how on the nose the morality was in Squid Game. Just be good, right? Don't chase money, just be good and you'll win in the end, right? But then we don't want to stop people making this. And I've always lived by the idea that art should comfort the disturbed, disturb the comfortable. That's a really nice thing. And I don't think that in terms of art, Squid Game disturbs enough. I think it had a happy ending. I think, you know, whatever happens, if it goes to season 2 and then he goes and solves the world and things like this, come on. Like, if you want to tell this story, tell it with death and destitution, and don't make the VIPs these degenerate, like, sexual deviants who seem almost farcical. Make them clever and suave, or make them banal, go into that Hannah Arendt idea. Do you know what I mean? Really tell this story a little bit better. So yeah, we need this art, but I think if we really want to talk about economic inequality, I think the art, here I am slagging off the most popular Netflix thing ever. But I think it can be done a little bit better if we seriously want to address real life problems.
Yes, and there is a strange dichotomy that is clearly going to happen out there in about a week's time, that the same people who, and I saw this, you must have seen it, were talking in, you know, deeply profound terms about the terrors of inequality, you know, having seen this show, and the challenges of Korean society, and all, perhaps a lot of issues we spoke about today, and the plight of foreign workers and North Korean defectors, and, you know, really deeply morally concerned about these things. They're all going to smile in a week's time and have a little chuckle inside themselves when they see the Halloween costumes that are for Squid Game, and which is clearly going to be everybody's costume this year. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's such a temporary attachment to a problem that if you actually cared about, you would do something about it. I think that's probably what lies at the heart of all these things. Perhaps it's that we just don't care that much, David. And I think that's one of the, so if there's a deep problem in your life or something, maybe, pick some random person and their husband or their wife, they've got a problem with their husband or wife. If they really care about it, they're going to try and fix it. And I don't mean talk about it, just talk about try and fix it. If they're really concerned about their child's education, they're going to sit them down at night and read to them and try and improve their math and things like this. If they say they're concerned about their child's education, and then the child sits down in the other room and they don't care and they watch TV every night, perhaps one of the things we should recognize from that is they have two moral theories in their minds. One is, I want my child to improve. And this other moral theory is, I can't be bothered doing it. And I don't want to be doing it. So, and I think that may be one of the issues here. It's that we're missing a little bit, that people simply are not wanting to do it. They say it, but really deep down, they don't care that much, which is an uncomfortable truth to come to.
And that's why perhaps we're happy for Netflix and boy bands and celebrities to say it for us, because then we don't have to think, we don't have to take a stance, and it can be a very pure and curated message that's, friendly. It can be shown on TV. It has a happy ending, and I think you're right. It absolves us of the responsibility, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's the way we should be doing things. More sort of, we almost get in a situation where we're afraid to speak because of the perils of social discourse these days can be really difficult, right? And so perhaps it's easier when people speak for us, but we shouldn't lose sight of that. I'll just draw, just in case anyone does listen, there's a South Korean economist called Gi-hoon, and he does a great lot of work on economic inequality. He's not going to solve all the problems, and some people might like him or not like him, but he's at the University of Cambridge, and he's written quite a few books on economic inequality. And so if you want perhaps a South Korean global perspective, definitely recommend some of his stuff. Yes.
I've read a few small things of his, and I do think they're actually quite interesting. I think that's a central thing there, though. What do you do next? So once you really care about inequality, what is it that you do next after you say that you care? And if people actually care, I think they'll do the next thing, which is not watch the TV show, not watch the 5-minute YouTube clip and click thumbs up, but read the academic paper. Read the theory, get involved in the debates, organize on the streets. And the fact that we're not seeing those things, I really think it's because people don't want them enough. So sure, they want them, but they don't really want them or they do them. And I think whenever something really important happens, like the country wants to get rid of Park Geun-hye, for example, there's no problem getting enough people on the streets. But when you have a problem like social inequality and economic inequality, which South Koreans say in polls that they're really deeply frustrated about, and yet you can't get people to actually do anything with their lives, I think you have to condemn the people. When that sounds, as that came out of my mouth, that sounds terrible.
But you have to also acknowledge the system in which the people live. So we've seen what the South Korean people have done throughout history, donating gold during the Asian financial crisis and things like that, all the hardships that they've overcome and done that. But now South Korean people and people all around the world, but they find themselves in a situation where they are encouraged to be individual, to live according to their own desires, and to have a Netflix account and a YouTube and all of these things that encourage solitary individual pursuits. Now, I fight really hard with my kids to make us all watch a movie together in the living room. They're young, but they already want their own pads and watch their own things. Jed, when we grew up, we never had that, right? You had to watch stuff with your family. You had to watch stuff that you didn't like because there was no choice. But I think there's genuinely something in that. And when you say we have to condemn the people, I think we also have to look at we also have to look at the system and what's being encouraged in terms of culture. So there's always this, we're going back and forward, I think, between individual responsibility and cultural influences. And I don't think we can really separate them. I think they're both so important.
I think I should rephrase it. We should condemn the values of the people, which drags it a little closer to culture. I've kept you much longer than I should. We should end this on a couple of final questions here. You mentioned the second series. There will be one, of course, but it's going to be terrible, I have to assume, as well. It's not going to be very good. And what turned me off, I mean, anything could be good, but I'm not sure how you felt about the last scene with the old man dying, and behind it all, he is, he's the guy that's running the show, and they're playing this game, and then he dies, and it ended in such a contrived, and as you've been saying a few times, suddenly the guy is going to go back, and he's going to go back to the game, and he's going to get them, rather than just there are a few messages in the game at a certain time. I had the quote, I've got the quote in front of me. When the old guy, we think he dies in the game, and we think he's actually going to die, he says, what a great way to go. You made this fun. And that is a catharsis that I think you touched on a bit as well, that it's things like that. They dragged the old man towards life. They drag people towards taking ownership for themselves when they're in these horrible situations. And they don't have to be as completely negative as they can be. There are some uplifting moments. I think there's another moment when a guy at the end on the game with the bridge, and he says, I'll go first. And he says something like, I want to claim ownership over my life. Now, he immediately regrets it, of course, but I might end by asking you about that end. I thought there's a nice, dirty moral principle to finish on, and then they polished it up at the end with the return of the old man and the return of the game and the guy walking back at the end, and this idea that don't worry, it'll all be good in the end.
Yeah, and in terms of there's a couple of ways I would look at this just before I address the morality, and this is culture as well. Growing up, things were often only sort of one season or two seasons. Things ended. There wasn't this desire to do another one. Like, leave it on top, leave it when it's good, right? And sometimes the best dramas and series are like that. It's only going to be, economic incentives that push people to make another one. And we've seen all the remakes of everything. They never live up to it. And Gi-hoon as a character, they already know who he is. We know he doesn't have a special set of like Liam Neeson talents or anything like that. He's just an everyman. So all the other side characters are dead. So second season, the director said that he's written a Star Wars or a Harry Potter, and I'm not quite sure. Why not write something new? Okay, yes. So if you've done that, there's this fear. Well, it might not be profitable. It might not make money. Well, who cares, right? There's always this thing that money drives what is produced, and I'm very disappointed with that aspect of it. I would, you made life fun. The ending of it, they have that bet whether someone's going to help the homeless person, right? Just before the old guy croaks. Imagine nobody comes to help the homeless person. It goes past 12 o'clock. The old guy laughs, dies, and that's it.
Yes.
Then that's Squid Game. Then that's something. But this whole, maybe I want too much, but I'm just like, if Squid Game is going to be this cultural phenomenon that it is, and it's going to deal with these issues that it is, like, I don't think it really always achieves that. I think it's just a kind of a beautiful kid's story with lots of violence and cool costumes in. After Squid Game, for some reason, I started to rewatch The Wire. I don't know if you've ever seen The Wire, but yes. I saw it once about 15 years ago. And I decided, well, is Squid Game really good? Let me go back and start and watch The Wire again, because that's one of the best TV shows, people would say. You know what amazed me? It was that how less, in terms, there was far less swearing and violence in The Wire than in Squid Game. And that amazed me, because you wouldn't naturally assume that, right, in terms of the content. But I think Squid Game is a lot of gore and color and hyper realistic stuff, but underneath it, there's not all that real depth to it. I think it's attractive and it's beautiful, but I don't think it has the depth of analysis that you could get in something like Quire. And I think we want there to be, because we want to say that those 9 hours were well spent. And, I feel more enlightened now, but I'm not quite sure it's there. It's good, but I don't think it has a candle to things that have come before.
Can I offer a thought of why I think, as you've been speaking, I've been thinking why you thought the morality was on the nose. Well, I quite liked some aspects of it. I've been thinking, why did I like it? Because it clearly was overplayed, the morality. And I think it's because every time a little moral twist happened, I had a thought and I was like, well, that's interesting. And I'll speak to David about that. But really what was happening in all those moments, as I look back, is it was a pick and mix. It was a la carte morality. As in, I suspect what they did, they're writing a scene and the morality was going in one direction. They said, well, let's not let it just play out that way. Let's twist it and say, oh, it's even worse than it was, or they're better than they are in this situation. And when they get another situation, I think there's always a press in the back of the writer's mind. Don't let people get comfortable with the morality. Twist and change it. And it always comes across almost as twist and change it just for the sake of changing. And a show like The Wire, which again I can't remember very well, but what I do remember, you're not jumping from pillar to post with changes in the moral outlooks of the characters. They're all in the same world, and they all live often by a very similar moral principle or moral theories in their minds. You're not stuck thinking, well, that was interesting, philosophically interesting, and interesting to bring up in a podcast, but completely unbelievable.
Yeah, and like in The Wire, the good guys die, and it's bleak, but it's believable, and it's a well told story. So, yeah, Squid Game raises a lot of talking points because it has those twists and it has those shakes, and there's the big reveals, and I sound like I've ragged on it a little bit, but it's good, and it's an enjoyable piece of drama. But in terms of the deeper philosophical underpinnings, to me personally, like I said, they're a little bit shallow, a little bit on the nose.
Great moment to end the podcast on as well, unless you had anything else to add, David.
Only that it's been a genuine pleasure to speak with you, Jed, because, speaking to you, it's a conversation, and when you speak, not only do I learn, but it gets my mind racing, and I start thinking of things that I hadn't thought of before I was speaking to you. So thank you, for all that you do, and thank you for the conversation, Jed. It's been a pleasure as always, mate.
Well, I have to admit, it's been a pleasure of mine, and all those kind words you just said, I must return to you as well. And before I do leave, of course, I'm going to link below the podcast links to David's weekly column in the Career Times, which I read each and every week here, but also a link to your new podcast. Correct me if it's Career Deconstructed, and you're 3 or 4 episodes in?
Yep, currently coming up to recording 4 and 5. Yeah, Career Deconstructed is the podcast. It's run on 2 principles, Jed. The first one is that I speak to Korean people about Korea, so it's not me speaking. But I try to get Korean people always. And the second one is I try to balance between men and women. And those are the 2 principles: speak to Korean people, speak to men and women. And
you have me as a listener, only 3 or 4 episodes in. I've listened to the first 3 already, and planning on stealing some of your guests for my podcast. It is that good.
Yeah, it's there's a small commission for each one's contact, but other than that, it's a good, Jed.
Well, on that, I meant everything I said, David. It's been a pleasure. We must do it again sometime. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you, Jed. Love it.